Ngifuna inhliziyo efana nekaJesu umsindisi. Oh yeah, ngifuna inhliziyo ilamanda. Ibanje sonfela zeka Satane. Ngifuna inhliziyo kaJesu. Ngena sona Jesu umsindisi.
Yeah. We're done.
We are back again, the bass quartet, and today we're featuring Cowton, and we're doing a song by Stan Zimbabwe, Ngifuna.
Yeah.
Just gives the key.
Ngifuna inhliziyo. Ngifuna inhliziyo efana nekaJesu umsindisi.
Other people and their walk with God. So they didn't just hurt themselves. They didn't just push themselves away from God. They didn't just walk in disobedience themselves. They didn't just force other people. They actually became a stumbling block to other people who sought to follow God. Now let's look at the flip side. We begin to look at Samuel. 1 Samuel 2:18. But Samuel ministered before the Lord. I love how it starts with but. It's the contrast here between the sons of Eli and Samuel. Samuel ministered before the Lord even as a child, wearing a linen ephod. Takeaway number 5, learning to listen. Now this is the positive. Learning to listen leads to purity and obedience. Samuel's moral ascent is contrasted with the moral descent of the sons of Eli. In the same sanctuary where an obedient person prospered, that was Samuel, the proud and the arrogant, they were condemned. And we can see that. Let's read verse 21, the second half, verse 21. Meanwhile, the child Samuel grew before the Lord. Takeaway number 6, learning to listen, it leads to spiritual growth. It's an incredible contrast between him growing in grace and growing in the knowledge of God, growing in character development, and them degrading. Now we see more degradation take place in the next verse, verse 22. This is Eli's sons. Eli was very old, and he heard everything his sons did to all Israel, and how they lay with the woman who assembled at the door of the tabernacle of meeting. The tent of meeting, this is the place between a holy God and his people, became defiled by the corrupt priests forcing themselves, you could say, on the women who were there. Takeaway number 6, lack of listening leads to pain and suffering in people around us. Because they refused to listen, other people suffered the consequences of their choices. Eli rebuked his sons, but he didn't remove them from office, and he ought to have. The boys should have died for what they did, and yet their father only said, please change, please change, please change, and that was all that ever happened. Verse 25, jump down to verse 25, second half. They did not heed the voice of their father. He pleaded with them, but they didn't heed because the Lord desired to kill them. Takeaway number 8, lack of listening, it can lead to death. Serious consequences when we do not listen to God. Let's jump down to 1 Samuel 3. Now we're transitioning again. This is when Samuel hears, remember he goes to bed, and he hears a voice, Samuel, Samuel, and he runs to Eli, and he says, you called me. I didn't, son. Go back and lie down. And then he goes just to bed, and he hears the voice again. 3 times God calls to Samuel. We're in 1 Samuel 3, verse 10. This is the 3rd time. The Lord came and stood and called as at other times, Samuel, Samuel, and Samuel said, speak, for your servant hears. Takeaway number 9, learning to listen begins with asking God to speak to you. Have you asked God to speak to you?
Wow.
I don't think I've asked enough. Have you gone before God and said, speak, Lord, your servant is listening. Would you instruct me? Would you teach me? I want to learn. And then what Samuel heard was a judgment against the house of Eli, and he didn't want to hear that. His first prophetic revelation, that's your child. That's not what you want to hear. And it says in verse 15, Samuel lay down to mourning, opened the doors of the house of the Lord, and he was afraid to tell Eli the vision. We jump down to verse 18. Samuel told Eli everything and hid nothing from him. And Eli said, it is the Lord. Let him do what seems good to him. Takeaway number 10, learning to listen. It involves courage and faith. It's not always easy to listen to God. And it's not always easy to walk in obedience when God speaks to you. But the result, so let's look at those takeaways real quick. Lack of listening, it leads to lack of knowledge of God, disobedience, force, you becoming a stumbling block for other people, pain and suffering in those around you. It can even lead to death. But learning to listen leads to purity and obedience, to spiritual growth. It begins with asking God to teach you and to speak to you. And it involves courage and faith. I don't know about you, but I want to learn to listen.
Amen.
Ooh, I love that lesson, Jill. Thank you. I'm Shelley Quinn. I have Wednesdays, and the title is simply Self-Reliance. So this young prophet Samuel, he grows in the Lord, and now God has him anoint Saul as a king. And what our lesson is really about today is the 3 steps to Saul's downfall, and it's all because of self-reliance. But let me give you a little history before we get in this. In 1 Samuel 10, verse 8, Samuel the prophet specifically instructed Saul the king in this way. 1 Samuel 10:8, you shall go down before me to Gilgal. This is the site of Israel's base camp during the days of the conquest. He said, and surely I will come down to you, Saul, to offer burnt offerings and make sacrifices of peace offerings. 7 days you shall wait till I come to you and show you what you should do. So Saul the king's got these instructions, but if you turn to 1 Samuel 13, I'm just going to kind of summarize what happened. This was an interesting history lesson for me. I really went back to study this. In 1 Samuel 13, 1 through 9, what's happening? They're expecting Ammonites to retaliate for Saul's victory at Jabesh Gilead. So Saul chooses an elite guard of 3,000 soldiers, and then he sends the rest of the men back to their tents. He posts his son, Jonathan, with 1/3 of the men. 1,000 of the men went with Jonathan to Gibeah. And then Saul and the other 2,000, they are guarding the approach to Bethel and Gibeah from the east. So right now they're at peace with the Philistines. They weren't expecting the Philistines to do anything, but what happened? The Philistines had this outpost, this guard post at Geba, G-E-B-A. Do you say Geba? Geba? Whatever this town was. And this outpost posted a threat to Israel's kingdom. So what does Jonathan do? He's there with 1,000 men, and he says, I'm going to take care of this threat. So he attacks the garrison that the Philistines had. He defeats them. Now the Philistines mobilize a counterattack, and they've got thousands of horsemen and thousands of chariots. So King Saul is realizing what's going on. He blows the horn, and he's blowing on that ram's horn, saying, hey, there's going to be a greater battle. Come back for the rest of the army. And then he departs their staging area in Michmash. He retreats to Gilgal, leaving the Philistines in control of the central plateau. So this is really a serious situation. And the Israelites become panic-stricken. Their morale is deteriorating. Guess what? They forgot the victory at Jabesh. They go from faith to fright. And now they start to scatter. Wow. They're actually deserting their post, and they leave Saul with no more than 600 men at Gilgal. So what happens to Saul? He's watching his dwindling resources. He panics, and he forgets that Gideon's army went from 32,000 to just 300. And with the Lord's blessing, with just 600 men left, he could have been victorious. But to him, this is a crisis situation. He becomes impatient. He's supposed to be waiting 7 days at Gilgal. He's waiting, and he's waiting, and 6 days pass, and all of a sudden, he's impatient, and he doesn't wait for the prophet to come and offer the sacrifice, give advice for the battle. It's possibly the early part of the seventh day. He presumptuously assumes the responsibility. And the king Saul goes out and offers the sacrifices, and no sooner than he does this, on the horizon, here comes the prophet Samuel. So Saul failed the test of his character. That's all there is to it. He directly disobeyed God's command. Now let's pick up. We're ready to go for it. 1 Samuel 13:11.